Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam. In the last video, I was talking about this notion of how we should try to stick to our spiritual pay grade by, in essence, not granting credence or acting as if we already know that we are one with everything, or we know that the world is just a simulation and so on, because we run the risk of doing what's known as spiritual bypassing. In other words, not really getting our hands dirty and resolving our emotional hang-ups and so on. And so we can rob ourselves out of the real and hard-earned path to wisdom by doing that. In this video, I want to talk about how there is a very persistent idea or a very persistent notion which is responsible for preventing our mind from realizing that, in essence, we are the pure light of awareness, or that we are indeed one with everything, or that indeed there is nothing to be done, right? So these high spiritual truths are correct. In the last video, I was making a case for why we should not just believe them rather than doing the work that leads us to those realizations. But then the question comes, if it is correct that there's nothing to do, or that the world is just a simulation, why can't I see it? Why is it that people who are either lucky enough or persistent enough to go through this process can say with full conviction and correctness that the world is sort of a simulation, really, and not real in the way that we make it out to be, or that we are one with everything, or that there's nothing to do? How come I cannot see that? And I think that this is down to this one notion, this very persistent notion of idea that we hold in our mind. And I'll give you straight up what the idea is, and then we can unpack why, even though we know, even though I tell you that idea, we still need to do the work in order to disabuse ourselves from it. The idea is that things should, could, or ought to be different than they are. Yeah? So we impose on ourselves notions of coulda, shoulda, woulda, and we are haunted by them. And we begin to minimize or ignore the value of the present moment, our present moment experience, or we minimize it as a means to an end, and the end is to somehow change things that they may become acceptable to us, or that we may become acceptable in the eyes of our significant others. So that lack of acceptability of the way we are or the way things are is the idea that we are oppressed by. That's the thing that we liberate ourselves from. Now, you could say, I see. So the fact that I believe I'm not good enough, or that things are not good enough, is what's preventing my enlightenment. So if I just change that belief, then I'm done, right? We'd be tempted to say that, right? Like, all I need to do is not believe that then, right? Pretty simple. Seems pretty simple. But it's not, because as it turns out, Leo DiCaprio was right in the movie Inception. Spoiler alert, if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it, but I'm about to spoil the movie. In Inception, he says that an idea is like a virus, and that is almost, once an idea takes over the mind, it's almost impossible to kill, almost impossible to get rid of. Because it becomes an implicit part of how we see the world. It becomes part of where we're coming from when we engage with reality. And so he's called Mr. Hobbs in that movie, right? And he knows that an idea is difficult to kill because he implanted an idea in his late wife. And it is the idea that led to her committing suicide. The idea was that the world was not real, and she truly believed it. He implanted that idea while they were in a dream. She took her out of the dream, but she still kept believing that the real world was not real. right? So that is all to explain in movie terms that an idea is extremely difficult to weed out once it becomes part of the core operating system of the mind. And make no mistake, the notion that things could, should, or ought to be different, or that I should be different or better, is an extremely deeply entrenched notion in the mind. It's not just some random idea of, oh, I see. Oh, I'm not enlightened because I've been thinking all along that I'm not good enough and that things should be different. Well, from here on, I'm just going to think I'm good enough and I'm done with the whole thing. Well, yeah, I could see how a mind could make that facile conclusion out of the whole thing. And, you'd be blowing the entire project up in the air because it doesn't work that way. The idea is very implicit. It is implicit in the way we place judgment and take a mental positionality about anything around us or within us. And anything at all that elicits notions of, oh, I dislike this, or, this is an outrage, I'm better than so-and-so could be better than that, they should be responding to me in a different way, my job sucks because, you name it. It is all based on the idea of this should be different or I should be different. So mental positionalities are all underpinned by this notion of how things should or ought to be different. And not only that, so it's not just a mental exercise, it's a whole body belief. Many of our psychosomatic nuts or kinks in the hose, right? Blockages are there to underpin the notion that things ought to be different. A lot of contractions in the body going, this ought to be different, or I ought to be different. It is not safe to be like this. I won't be happy if I continue being like this, and so on. So our entire system is geared towards underpinning this. And you could almost say that this notion of things ought to be different, it's almost more a result of all that systemic contraction rather than the cause of it. It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing and maybe too philosophical to get into. But at the end of the day, the way to weed this idea out is to systematically confront the negative emotions that this idea uses to protect itself. So this idea will protect itself through shame, guilt, fear, anger, right? Whenever we suddenly feel the temptation to really simply allow things to be truly as they are and let our guard down and become vulnerable and open, all kinds of protectors come out of the woodwork and start to shame you or guilt you or make you angry or fearful. And if you still move in the face of those, then regret comes and still whacks you in the head after the fact, right? So this thing is protected by many, but like a ton of barbed wire, right? And it's it almost reminds me of Jesus and the crown of thorns. Like you can barely move in any direction without a thorn sort of encrusting painfully into your skin to protect that idea. It's obvious that the idea that you ought to perform and be a certain way comes from our upbringing and the fact that in order to receive nourishment and emotional support from our caregivers and our surroundings, we had to sort of be performers and act in certain ways. But that the mind generalizes that notion of I needed to be in a particular way during my childhood, and it simply creates a massive generalization called things ought to be different than they are, and I ought to be different than I am. I was discussing this notion with someone earlier today during a coaching session, and one of the ways in which this idea keeps oppressing us is through the denial of the ways in which we think and feel. Now, that is not to say that the ways in which we think and feel are always optimal and wholesome. No, I mean, we could be feeling emotions that are not particularly wholesome, having thoughts that are not particularly wholesome. But to deny those and to to wish that they were different is not the only available move, because to deny how we feel about things is to invalidate ourselves. So the available move is to validate everything that's there, not because it's wholesome or because we like it or because we want to preserve it forever and ever, but because it is there. The fact that it's there gives it its own validity. It's a self-confirming fact, in essence. And we don't want to go against the grain of that. We want to use that. We want to tap into the way things actually are. And from there, we stand a much better chance of entering into a constructive dance with our body and our emotional body and so on, right? So, yeah, short video today, and that is the essence of it. The essence is that there is a very persistent and oppressing notion that we and things should be different than they are. It is a very deeply entrenched notion. It cannot just be thought away, okay? So to know that this is the case and then go, oh, that means there's nothing to be done, is a silly thing to do, because the notion will simply show up in all kinds of ways until we resolve our samskaras, okay? But knowing that this is the case already makes us a little bit wiser, and we can start to notice how we invalidate ourselves by pushing aside things that we believe ought not to be the case in ourselves or our environment, by becoming self-righteous or critical or non-forgiving of others. Yeah. And so that's today's thought. There you have it. Very curious what you make of it. I think, just the last thing I'll say is, I think it's very important to know that though the final realization is that there was nothing to be done, that the arrival to that realization truly in our bones and to be able to live it in a way that is very loving and wholesome does not just require a cheap dismissal of the notion that we are doing something to gain enlightenment or cultivate ourselves. I think that's it's just not the way things work, right? So I hope that came across. Curious to hear what you guys make of it, and I'd love it if you like, share, and subscribe. So I'll be back with the next video pretty soon. Cheers. Bye bye.